he meets him, and he heals him. And compassion finds a way. There was a lady and a gentleman. They were on the search for a cat. And they ended up going to the SPCA, and they got a cat and had it for a little while. And they phoned back to the SPCA to tell them that they wouldn't be able to keep it. And the lady says, "I'm awfully sorry. It's a dear cat, and I'm fond of it. But the cat is a bird killer. And we just can't have a bird killer in our house. And I'm sure my husband would be glad to make a contribution to the SPCA, for the trouble that this is, but we just need to return the cat." And the gentleman said, "Okay, well, can you and your husband come in and deliver the cat back to us?" And she says, "Oh, I'm sorry, but he's up north shooting deer." Do you catch it? 2 weeks ago, we started on our journey to Jerusalem. And we saw how Jesus met with Nicodemus. And how Nicodemus was met with compassion. How the compassion of Christ just shone through in his meeting with him. And then last week, we looked at the woman at the well. And if you don't see the compassion of Christ there, really, that was an amazing sign of his compassion. And this week we come to the temple. He's back at the temple, which means that probably a year has passed since John chapter 3, or another feast has happened and they've made their way back there. Not sure which feast it is. It doesn't tell us why they've gone back to Jerusalem, but they have. And they come into the temple. And as they come into this temple through the sheep gate, it says that there's a pool there. And many people were brought to this pool. As we see in John 5:3, it says, "Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed." People would bring their disabled folks to the pool. And the reason why they brought them to the pool is we see it there in the passage where he says, "When the water is stirred, I have no one to help me get into the water." You see, what they believed was that an angel of the Lord would come down and stir the water. And when the angel stirred the water, the first person into the pool would be healed. Well, he's paralyzed. And so, the person who was either blind or paralyzed or lame or whatever, someone else would beat him to the pool, basically. And so he's laying there. He sits. He waits. And it seems like it's probably a daily ritual that his family brings him in to sit, to lay, to wait, to see if he receives a healing. But Jesus sees him. There's a whole crowd there. There's many more people who are dealing with other illnesses. But he sees him, and he singles him out. And the reason why he sees him, we find in verses 5 and 6, is that it says there that one who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" In one of the other versions of this story in the other Gospels, it says, "What can I do for you?" Do you want to get well? It seems like a pretty straightforward question, but think about this. The man had not been able to walk for 38 years. Think about his muscles. He hasn't been working his muscles like with physiotherapists and stuff. He's atrophied. His muscles are, not working. And after 38 years, Jesus says to him, "Pick up your mat and walk." But before that, he asks him the question, "Do you want to get well?" He has a desire to be healed. That's why he's by the pool. He wants to regain his ability to walk. He wants to be able to help his family. He wants to. That's why he's there. But the man's really in a hopeless situation. Nobody, after 38 years, just stands up and walks. But into this man's despair, our compassionate Christ enters. And he says, do you want to get well? You see, no matter how trapped you might feel in your troubles, how trapped you might feel in what you're going through, or maybe there's something that you're just not understanding, God can minister to that deepest need. He can come in and meet you where you are, in the midst of whatever problem, hardship, or loss of hope that you may be in. God may have a special work for you to do in the midst of this as well. You see, many people have ministered out of their hurt, and some people who have overcome that hurt have been able to enter into other people's lives who have been going through a similar situation. But Jesus comes and he asks the question. He says, do you want to get well? A fellow by the name of Bill Hybels, he shares this story. He says, I don't want to be a self-absorbed person, but truthfully, sometimes I get busy and I forget God for a time. He said, that's when God reminds me to slow down and to refocus. A while ago, I was half walking, half running from my office to the church's furthest seminar room to meet with some leaders. I had my schedule all planned out, including how long it was going to take me to walk, how fast I had to go to make my walk and to get there on time. When I got partway there, I saw someone from our building services staff. He was washing a window. And he was washing that window with enthusiasm of someone who has just been given a life sentence. And I remember thinking, if this was a contest between the rag and the window was winning. I was planning to walk right by, but I could sense God squeezing my hand and whispering, stop. Just ask him how he's doing. It looks like he's hurting. And so I stopped and I said, are you okay? He looked at me and his eyes said, I'm not, but I know you're always busy. And if I start telling you what's breaking my heart and you say, gotta go, bye, it's going to be too hurtful for me. And so I could see this. God squeezed my hand a little harder and said, you have the time. Take the time. And he said, let the other meeting wait. And so I spoke to the man again and I asked him, I'm not in a hurry. What's up? And what came out was a kind of hurt that only a couple of us on the staff could identify with. And so I spent the next 20 minutes encouraging him. I prayed for him, spent time with him. Later on, he says, as I reflected on that moment with God and that man by the window, I realized that that particular staff member has probably heard hundreds, if not thousands, of my sermons. Yet years later, when he looks back and he reflects on the impact that my life had on his, he probably won't remember any of the words that I said, but he probably will remember the day that I stopped and I talked with the man by the window, that I took the time to enter into his life. Paul said this in chapter 3, verse 12 of Colossians. He said, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Think about what he's saying there. He's talking to people who know Christ. He's talking to us today, people who know Jesus. And he's saying, clothe yourselves. That means put on Christ. Clothe yourself. Make this as much part of you as the clothing you're wearing. And the things that he's telling us to clothe ourselves with is compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. You see, Christ was the ultimate example of one who was clothed in those characteristics of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And so he enters into this man's life, and he says to the man, take your mat and walk. 38 years, muscles have atrophied. He's able to stand and walk. And he's able to pick up his mat, and he's able to move. He's been at the temple gate for a long time, paralyzed, unable to move, and he moves. And then, as he's walking through the temple, the Jewish leaders see him. As we see in 5, 10, and 11, it says, the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, it's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat. But he replied, the man who made me well said to me, pick up your mat and walk. Think about this. Those religious leaders have walked past that man themselves. They have seen that man sitting at that pool. They have noticed him before. And the thing that they pick up on isn't the fact that he was paralyzed for 38 years and he's walking. It is the fact that he's picked up his mat and he's carrying his mat on the Sabbath. I don't know about you, but I think that that would be more of an occasion for joy and thanksgiving and rejoicing than being nitpicky about a rule of the law. You could see that the man had been healed. He's walking. He's able to carry his mat, but these Orthodox Jews stop him and remind him that he's breaking the law. You see, the Jews had taken the law and they had added thousands of little rules and regulations to the law, trying to define it right down to the smallest detail. And the Sabbath had lost its divine intent. Why is there a Sabbath? Why do we take a day off? It's to rest and to focus on God, right? In Mark 2, 27 and 28, Jesus said this about the Sabbath. He said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. You see, God created the Sabbath for our benefit. I remember reading a little while ago that when, I think it was Stalin, who came into power in Russia, he decided that it would be a great idea that the people should work for 14 days and then have a day off. And you know what he found out after doing this for a while? Production was worse. People were doing worse. People were getting sick, having to take off time. Why? Because people need to rest. And why is it that God placed it in a 7-day cycle? That we rest on the 7th day? It's so that, that's the rhythm that he put in place. God created the Sabbath for our benefit, not for his own. God doesn't derive any benefit from having us rest on the Sabbath. But we are restored both physically and spiritually when we take time to rest and to focus on him. For the Pharisees, the laws of the Sabbath had become more important than Sabbath rest, making sure that everything was in place and every I and T was dotted and crossed. I was reading of a fellow by the name of Tilden Edwards in his book Sabbath Time. He wrote this. He said about a family with teenage children that they had decided as part of their Sabbath commitments that they would spend the day not criticizing one another. So on Sundays, there was no criticism allowed in their home. And as months went by, and they kept this commitment, they realized that more and more of their children's friends were coming over on Sundays just to hang out at their house. No one in the family talked about this commitment, but somehow other teenagers knew that this home was a good place to be. It was a place of rest, but it was also a place of restoration, and it was safe, and there was hope. You see, this man was healed. And the religious leaders picked up on the fact that he was carrying his mat instead of seeing the restoration that took place. And so Jesus, later on, he sees him. In John 5:14, it says that he had found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you." You see, here Christ is taking it a step further. This man was healed, as I said to the children, this man was healed physically, but he needed to take it a step further and recapture his heart as well. To stop sinning. You see, this man had experienced a great miracle. He was lame and now he could walk, but he needed even a greater miracle. And there is a greater miracle than him walking again. It's the healing of his heart. It's the forgiveness of sin. It's the restoration of life. And Jesus says to the man, it's good that you're healed, basically. But now seek God's forgiveness and draw closer to God. Experience the restoration of your heart. Experience the restoration of life. However, the Jewish leaders, they saw both the mighty miracle of healing and a broken law, and they threw the miracle aside and they focused their attention on the broken rule, because the rule was more important to them than the miracle of healing. God, you have to hear this, God is prepared to work in our lives, but we can shut out his miracles by limiting our views about how he works and what he's up to. We need to draw upon him. We need not only to experience his healing physically, but also his healing spiritually, restoring our hearts, restoring our lives to him. A lady by the name of Barbara Johnson, she's an author and speaker. She has since passed, but in one of her books, she shares this story. She says, "I had just finished speaking at one of the last Women of Faith conferences in 1998, challenging the audience to really think about this phrase, what would Jesus do, in their everyday situations. And one way I apply the what would Jesus do principle in my life is giving people buttons that say someone Jesus loves has AIDS. A moment after leaving the auditorium, that button would speak volumes. Running to grab a bite to eat before heading to my book table, Barbara and director Christy Barnes came to Barbara. And her eyes were big and she was talking fast. She said, "A prostitute's hiding from her pimp upstairs, threatening suicide. You need to talk to her." And for a moment I thought, well, why me? But quickly I gathered 5 women to come with me to the locker room where the prostitute had been taken. A suicide unit, emergency personnel, and police, well, they were on their way. But Christy filled me in as she walked, concluding that the fact was that this prostitute had full-blown AIDS. How will the other women react? I thought, I'm sure that they've never been near a prostitute, let alone anyone with AIDS. She was about 35 years old. She was dirty, and she smelled of sleeping in a dumpster. Her pimp was trying to kill her because she had stopped turning tricks. The jagged scar on her face and the bullet hole in her leg were evidence of that fact. The first thing I gave to her was one of my buttons. As she held it tightly, we talked about how Jesus could give her a new heart and a new life, how he could bring healing to her and restoration. And within minutes, she was praying to accept Christ as Savior. Now began the real, what would Jesus do? Action. One woman scrambled to get soap, shampoo, and towels. Another went up to get a t-shirt, sweatshirt from the booth where we were selling these shirts. As everyone disappeared, I sat with the prostitute on the stool in the shower and started to clean her. And inspiration hit me. Maybe while I was scrubbing, I could baptize her too. And then I saw the fresh, gaping wound down her chest. We need to get you a doctor. And she said, no, I just need to get out of town. By the time we were done, with my head half soaked and frizzy from the shower's spray, enough money had been scraped together for a bus ticket out of town. My helpers gathered around us and we prayed. Their genuine love for this woman from the street brought tears to my eyes. The prostitute was in a win-win situation. If the pimp caught her and killed her, well, she would be safe in the arms of Jesus. If she made it to her family in Chicago, God would give her a brand new start. Either way, she was a winner. And someone called a taxi and she said, wait, she said, I need the button. Pulling her filthy shirt out of the trash, she removed the button and proudly pinned it to her own new, clean sweatshirt. We ran outside to catch the cab. Before she rolled up the window, I gave her one last hug. And I said, if you get to heaven before you get to Chicago, you can polish the pearly gates for me, she said. Restoration. Healing. You see, Jesus brought physical healing out of compassion for this man. But the real healing that he received was the restoration of his heart. Stop sinning and live for me, basically. This morning we're going to be coming to God at the table. We're going to be spending time reflecting, but also committing our lives to Christ. And I guess one of the questions that I have is, it's the same that Jesus said. Do you want to get well? And ultimately, the healing that we need is to go deeper in Him. Because there is always deeper. There is always deeper healing that we need in our lives, deeper healing in our hearts, to be able to draw closer to Him, to be able to gain His help, and to gain wholeness from Him. So let's pray together. Father God, I thank you so much that you